You to the second night of Impact Symposium 2012. We come together to challenge our preconceptions and expand upon that which is taught in the classroom by asking the question, what is the future of American foreign policy?
Last night, Senator Lamar Alexander urged us to use energy policy as a lens through which to study foreign policy. Tonight, we continue to frame our discussion of foreign policy by welcoming Governor Jon Huntsman and General Wesley Clark to the stage.
As NATO's former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, a Rhodes Scholar, and a published author, General Wesley Clark brings to the discussion a wealth of knowledge. In his book, Winning Modern Wars, Iraq Terrorism and the American Empire, General Clark leverages his experience in Kosovo to provide critical analysis to the conflicts in the Middle East.
Joining General Clark, Jon Huntsman Jr. is able to draw on his vast experience as governor of Utah, ambassador to Singapore, and most recently, ambassador to China. His fluency in both Mandarin and East Asian diplomacy complements General Clark's experience in Europe and the Middle East.
General Clark and Governor Huntsman will sit down with Professor Brett Benson of the Political Science Department to converse about the most pressing issues today, ranging from Iran to North Korea. Professor Benson specializes in theory of international relations and currently teaches courses in Chinese politics and international strategy.
We want to thank the administration and the Poli-Sci Department for all the help they've given us in putting on this event. And at this time, please join me in welcoming General Clark, Governor Huntsman, and Professor Brett Benson to the 49th Annual Impact Symposium.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent job.
Thank you. Good to see you guys.
Well, I would just like to add my voice of welcome to that of David and Danielle. It truly is an honor and a privilege to have these two distinguished guests with us here this evening. Before we begin the substantive portion of our conversation, I would like to just underscore a couple of points about the biographies that David and Danielle just described, for the purpose of just emphasizing the accomplishments of these two individuals. To begin with, General Clark, as Danielle mentioned, was the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, which of course entails the being in control of the Central Command for NATO. And if I'm correct, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think that involves commanding approximately or over 100,000 troops, something like that. To put this into perspective for our Vanderbilt students, since 1951, when the Supreme Allied Command was established, there have been only 16 Supreme Allied Commanders. Two of those were people that I think we would know, Dwight Eisenhower and Alexander Haig. And so this puts him in very select and impressive company. So we're the beneficiaries tonight. It's our privilege to have him here, and I think that we're going to benefit from his vast experience, both in the military and foreign policy. With respect to Governor Huntsman, as David mentioned, he has had a lot of experience in different foreign policy posts. When he became ambassador to China, he did so at a time when the relations between China and the United States were somewhat chilly. And during his stint as ambassador, relations warmed significantly, and he made several breakthroughs on the diplomatic and also on the commercial front. I can say on a personal note, I have friends in China who have told me that he is one of their favorite ambassadors that served in China. And they cite as evidence for this his personal touch and his ability to connect with Chinese citizens because of some of the things that he did and the way that he reached out to them to put a sort of a human face on foreign policy with China. So on that front, and on that note, I would like to, if it's possible to impose on the governor and former ambassador, ask him to just say a few things in Chinese, and and sort of to tee this up, I would like to use some Chinese myself, and welcome him to China. Or sorry, I welcomed him to Vanderbilt, and ask him what his impressions are of the campus, if that's all right.
我今天非常高兴能够到这儿来跟你们每个人在一起。我想这个大学来说，你们都是很漂亮的学生，beautiful students。而且我听说你们就是这个我们美国最聪明的学生，是不是？ The smartest in the country, is that right? 对，就是我很大的，谢谢。
Thank you, Governor. That was fantastic. 欢迎你到我们大学来。
谢谢，非常高兴。
Okay.
中文也不错啊。
还行，还可以。So I think, for the format tonight, this is the way that we'll proceed. Each of our guests will take a few minutes just to give some thoughts about foreign policy, some of the things that they're thinking. And then from there, we'll have a question and answer session, a discussion between the three of us. I'll ask them questions and they'll respond to them. And then at the conclusion, we'll open the forum to Q&A from the audience. So with that, we'll begin with General Clark, and we'll turn the time over to you.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here at Vanderbilt. I've been here a few times, and I started coming here when I was a student at Lebanon, Tennessee, many years ago. It's a beautiful place with a great student body, and really appreciate all of you being here tonight. It's especially great to see the ROTC guys here in uniform. And do we have veterans? Are any of you all veterans in the audience? If you would, just stand up so we can recognize you and give you a round of applause. Thank you. So, just in an overview on foreign policy and where I'm coming from, in 1992, it was 20 years ago, I was a two-star general. I was commanding the 1st Cavalry Division in Fort Hood, Texas. I had 17,000 troops, 350 tanks, 350 personnel carriers, a battalion of Apache helicopters, 4 battalions of artillery, about 5,000 trucks, and 53 horses. And we were still training to fight the Soviet Union, even though the Cold War was over. During the next 9 years, when I was finishing up my military career, the United States was the only superpower. We were unchallenged and unchallengeable. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the great Latin American writer, and I'm sure many of you have read his works, he came to see me when I was the commander of troops in Panama and in Latin America, and he said, in 1996, he said, "It's very boring in the world today," he said, "because there is today only one ideology, and it is the ideology of democracy and capitalism. There is no other way." And a wave of democratic reform swept Latin America. It swept Europe and into Eastern Europe. And at the same time, in America, we had an explosion of technology and telecommunications with mobile phones and the internet, personal computing, and we signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, and China came out of the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989 and rejoined the world community economically. And there was an explosion, a global opening, which created something called globalism. And in America, we created 22 million jobs. So I went through my military service. I helped do the peace talks in Bosnia with Ambassador Holbrooke, and then I was a NATO commander, and I led NATO in the fight against Serb ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. But I retired. I stood on the parade field at Fort Myer. I looked at our troops out there from all the services. I'd been in the Army since Vietnam. I came home from Vietnam, wounded on a stretcher. I stayed for 30 years. The Army in Vietnam was an army that didn't want to be there. It was an army of draftees. The Army of 2000 was an army of volunteers. It was inarguably the best in the world. Our economy was producing actually a budget surplus. Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, was complaining that this surplus might destroy the ability of the Fed to make economic policy. Hundreds of thousands of young people from around the world had converged on the United States to try to understand the mysteries of American capitalism and Silicon Valley. The stock market was at record highs, and there was no challenge to America as far as the eye could see. And then 9/11 happened. And now people look back on the last 10 years and they call it a lost decade. 2 wars, 6,000 U.S. military dead, probably 25,000 wounded, maybe a fourth of that seriously. $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion in hard costs, another $1 trillion or $2 trillion in costs that will have to be repaid eventually to veterans and others as a result of the expenses of the war. A foreign policy that was distorted, and an economy that didn't grow, a national deficit that's $1 trillion a year, national debt as far as the eye can see, unemployment. The United States hasn't kept up with the growth in its own labor force. And on the horizon is China, now the second largest economy in the world, 10% economic growth for 30 years, asking others, has America failed? And so I look at it and I say it's not just about what you do abroad that gives you strength. I go back to what General Eisenhower said, the strength of America isn't the strength of its armed forces, it's the strength of the American economy. And so in 2012, a strong American foreign policy begins at home with a strong economy. We've got to create jobs, we've got to deal with the deficit, and we've got to create a new vision for what America is in the 21st century. We're no longer the nation guarding the world against the relentless spread of communism. But what are we? And that's the challenge that your generation has to help us solve.
Thank you, General.
Delighted to be here on this terrific campus. And let me just say right at the outset that I'm honored and delighted to be with General Wes Clark. I'm a Republican.
Should have said that too, and I'm
He's a
very
Democrat.
pleased.
Well, I'm a diplomat by training. So you check the boxes. You know, you're trained basically to say something when there's nothing to say, and nothing when there's something to say. You're always between a cliche and an indiscretion for the most part. And since I'm not asking for anybody's vote tonight, I don't care. So we can just have an open conversation about it. But General Clark has inspired a generation by wearing the nation's uniform, and with 2 boys, my only boys who are now in the nation's uniform, I admire that enormously. And as a Republican to a Democrat, I thank Wes for his service. And I'm reminded a Republican and a Democrat and an independent in the middle, you know, up here on the stage together. You know, the overriding need we have in this nation today is pulling together as people. We are divided, we are fractured, we are in pain because of the extreme polarization driven by, we could discuss this one all night, and I would have to tell you that one of the biggest challenges we will have during your lifetime, you students in the audience, is figuring out somehow, some way of reminding this nation that we are Americans first and foremost. And we're not going to solve any of these problems we have until we can get our act together as Americans, because at the end of the day, we're all taking this common journey, and we're all brought together, knit together by certain core values. And it's those core values that will continue to make us great as you look at it from a foreign policy context. So I look at it somewhat historically. Yeah, I was born in 1960. We exported $3 for every $2 we imported. We owned 36% of the world's GDP, science, technology. Seems that every Nobel Prize winner was from the United States of America. 25% of our economy was fueled by manufacturing. And I look at where we sit today, Wes, about 9%. We're in the middle of the Cold War. You know, we all knew the rationale for our foreign policy strategy when I was growing up: defense spending, balance of power politics. It was all couched very conveniently around the Cold War. And that gave way to the War on Terror, which, you know, we can talk about a little bit later. We've been through 10 years of that, and I'd say this nation has about had all it can take. We're ready to get out of Afghanistan. We're ready to get back on our feet as a nation. And I would say there's a void all of a sudden in front of us as Americans. It was convenient during the Cold War. It was convenient during the War on Terror. You could make an easy description for why we spent on defense as we did, or why our foreign policy strategy was the way it was. And now we're kind of staring into a void. And I think that the next leader in this nation, whomever that will be, Wes has tried, I've tried, we're probably too smart to ever try it again. But the next leader, and you all, as the generation of emerging leaders, you will have to define what fills that void and what this nation now makes the next big thing. Because I'm one who believes that we do well as Americans when we're able to pull together behind common goals. We've got a vision, we've got something worth shooting for out there. And we look at the world, we look at our place in the world, and we're drawing a few blanks. And I would submit to you that there are probably 3 or 4 things that we're going to have to base our foreign policy on as we go forward that are going to be critically important for this country and for your generation. Number 1, and Wes hit on it, we've got to get our house in order. Because you can't have a foreign policy. You can't project the goodness of our values. And I would tell you that what makes us great? Not the smart bombs, not the ships, not the troops. We respect them all. We pay for them all. But it's what it is that brings us together as Americans. Values. I don't care whether you're Republican, Democrat, or Independent. We all share common values of liberty, democracy, human rights, individual dignity, free markets. We've got to get on our feet in this nation. We've got to fix our core if for your generation we're going to have an effective foreign policy. Because I'm one who believes that our future foreign policy will be determined on, first of all, how strong we are at home. And I would tell you that Afghanistan is not this nation's future. Iraq is not this nation's future. Our nation's future is how well prepared we are as people to rise up and to meet the competitiveness challenges of the 21st century. And they're intense. And that's about economics, and that's about education. And it's going to play out over the Pacific Ocean in countries I've lived in before. I've lived over in Asia 4 times. And I have seen what the other side of the world is doing to prepare for their future. And I would humbly submit to you that if we don't get our act together, and you will be part of getting our act together, you in the audience who are wondering when your day will come, if you'll ever have to worry about these issues, your day will come. It will come a lot sooner than you think. If we don't get our act together, we'll see the end of the American century by 2050. And there's no reason to see that happen. No reason at all to see that happen. We got to get on our feet. Number 2, we've got to drive foreign policy with a priority that is economic policy. Everybody else does it in the world. We're used to protecting far corners of the world, which you can only do for so long until you can't afford it any longer. But it used to break my heart when I'd sit in Beijing as the United States ambassador. We have 100,000 troops in Afghanistan securing the land, paying a high price for it, and the Chinese move in and take the mining concession. And I say, this is an unsustainable model. We've got to trade, we've got to engage, we've got to use the lever of economic policy that I believe is going to bring strength and hope to regions of despair today that are giving rise to radicalism. Finally, let me just say, we've got everything a nation would ever want to succeed. You know, I've watched this from 10,000 miles away in Beijing, where you walk the streets of Beijing, you walk the streets of Shanghai, walk the streets of Guangzhou, and there's energy. Blue sky. You know, their time has arrived in China, so they think, but there are a lot of underlying tremors that we can talk about later. And you reflect on this country from 10,000 miles away, and you say, we still have all the attributes that any nation state would ever want to succeed. We just don't see it in ourselves sometimes. We're stable. We have rule of law. Now, how unique is that in the world today? We have the longest surviving constitution in the world. Greatest colleges and universities. A creative class, entrepreneurs, innovators, the envy of the world still. What's China trying to do? Trying to crack the code on innovation. What's Singapore trying to crack the code on innovation? They can't figure out how to get it done. And we have a pretty darn good armed forces, too. I think the best this country has ever seen. So I would submit to you, we've got a little work to do ahead. Your generation will be part of it. But never lose sight of the fact that despite our problems, we have all of the raw material, all of the ingredients this nation needs to get back on its feet and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. So to begin the question session here, I want to just give a shout out to my students and say I asked them what questions they would like to hear discussed tonight. And of course, a lot of different topics came up, but most of the questions organized very naturally into 3 different categories. My students were very, very interested in Afghanistan. They're also very interested in China and what the rise of China means for the United States and what it means for them in the future. They're also very interested in the question that's all nagging us today, and that is, how do you deny countries that are potentially dangerous from acquiring nuclear weapons? And in particular, they're interested in North Korea and Iran. So on that note, I'm going to begin with a question about Afghanistan. And I think this ties nicely into the introductory comments by both of our guests. Both of our guests have extensive foreign policy experience dealing with domestic publics in foreign countries. So the question is, what should our policy be, and what is the role of the United States in Afghanistan, and potentially in other places too, like Syria and potentially Libya, maybe Iran? What is the role of the United States? It looks like we hit the 10-year anniversary in Afghanistan, in the U.S. war in Afghanistan last year in October, and it looks like there will be a withdrawal now, and there's a possibility that the Taliban might reestablish itself. And so this has implications for the war on terror. On the other hand, it also has implications for the way that we proceed in intervening in other countries going forward. So I'd like to begin this question with General Clark. Given your experience in Kosovo, which by all accounts was overwhelmingly successful example of intervention by the U.S. military, what are some lessons that we can draw, both from your experience and how can we apply those to some of the challenges that we have in some of these areas going forward?
I appreciate the question, Brett. I want to just come back, if I could, before I go right into this and say that I want to thank Jon for what you said about getting our house in order, pulling America together, getting a consistent vision in foreign policy that is across the aisle, because that really is what we need to do. And we don't want Afghanistan and what we do in Afghanistan to become a distraction to that or another tool in partisan mudslinging and so forth, and because it's a very serious problem and we need to deal with it the right way. America has to strengthen its economy to be effective in the world. And even though by economic standards in a $14.5 trillion economy, $150 billion a year doesn't seem like much, which is what we're spending in Afghanistan, it's a huge distraction from the American economy. Think about what that $150 billion, if we spend it at home, might actually produce in the way of education, infrastructure investment, attention to science and research and development and engineering. It would be a fabulous kickstart for the American economy if you could get it. So the foreign policy and the economic policy are tied together. In Afghanistan in particular, we went into the war because we had to. The National Command Authority did not give the right instructions to the Commander-in-Chief, Tommy Franks. Should have told him, if you can get Osama bin Laden, get him. That's why we went there, not only to punish the Taliban government, but to go after Osama bin Laden. But the ball was fumbled in October, November, December 2001. Osama bin Laden escaped across the border. The administration then turned down the heat in Afghanistan, diverted resources in preparation for the invasion of Iraq, and let the Afghanistan situation simmer. Hamid Karzai came in and took over. But the Taliban are a creation not just of Afghanistan, but also of Pakistan. And Pakistan watched and waited and eventually put them back together again because Pakistan needs them in its regional struggle against India. If you ask the Pakistanis, they'll tell you that Hamid Karzai is an Indian at heart. And when he wasn't in Afghanistan, he was in India. And they don't trust him, they don't like him. And the Taliban is their way of having a grip on what they consider their strategic depth. We stayed there, we puttered around, and when Barack Obama came in after his campaign where he pledged to really intensify this conflict and finish it, we did get Osama bin Laden, and I can tell you from having sat in high meetings that was a very courageous decision by the president to send the SEALs in and get him. It would have been far easier to drop a bomb, and you would never have known. So I give the president a lot of credit for that. But that was the purpose of the mission there. The purpose was never to make Afghanistan a 51st state. So we've had our military is great. We've got wonderful leaders, tremendous soldiers, best military in the world, but we've been back and forth to this conflict for a long time. And after you're there, the shock effect wears off and people start looking at you and figuring out how to beat you. They know how to put improvised explosive devices in. Then they know how to make them so you can't detect them with mines. Then they know that you've got unmanned aerial vehicles and how to avoid the observation of the unmanned aerial vehicles. So they fight you on your techniques. We've done what we need to do in Afghanistan. We need to finish up the training mission. I hope we're not going to make a precipitous pullout, but the president says we need to come out 2014, come back out of the combat role after 2013. That's what we need to do. 3 years from now, 4 years from now, you won't be talking about Afghanistan. It'll be over. It'll be history. So we've done our mission there. Let's get on with the rest of the work we've got.
I would have to say with respect to Afghanistan, the longer we stay, the more we lose options as a nation. We have to say, what have we achieved over the last 10 years? And can we rightly consider that to be a success for our people and for the taxes that we have paid and the lives that we have lost? And I say absolutely. Because you can't change civilization. We tend to want to rush in and have a free election or 2 or 3 and forget that you've got to have civil society and an educated populace with which to deal with democracy longer term. But if you look at what we've done to date, we've had free elections. We've run the Taliban from power. We've dismantled al-Qaeda. We've strengthened civil society to some extent. Osama bin Laden is no longer around. And I say it's time to move on and declare victory and recognize, unfortunately, that I think civil war is inevitable. And there may be very little that we can do about that. I sat in India 2 days ago around a table in which they had the Pakistani ambassador to India, a very sensitive position for somebody to hold. And there's tremendous insecurity in the subcontinent about Afghanistan because I think they know what lies ahead when you start playing it out on the chessboard. And I think we as a nation, we need a serious conversation, not the 30-second debate sound bites that, I was subjected to not long ago, but a real discussion about our interests in Afghanistan. So here's what I think happens, sadly enough. We'll create a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, so says physics, and so does international relations. And it's likely that the Indians will take the northern tier of the country, maybe with the Russians in support of the Northern Alliance. The Pakistanis will likely support the Pashtun populations in the south. Iran will want to grab some of their western flank, which is traditionally their sphere of influence. And the Chinese are going to wonder what to do. Because for the first time, they will be stuck with a scenario that says, we have a festering regional problem on our periphery. We've always been able to look to the Americans to solve this one for us, so the Chinese love us and they hate us in Afghanistan. They love us because they don't have to do anything about it. And we've got troops that can hold the peace. They hate it because we have troops on their periphery, something that they don't like, and that's one of the problems with a unified Korea ultimately. So as this plays out, I think the prospects for conflict based upon those regions that will be carved up by the regional powers is very real. The difference between Afghanistan and Vietnam, for example, Vietnam wasn't surrounded by world powers. It wasn't surrounded by nuclear-armed world powers. So when you get Pakistan on one end of Afghanistan and India on the other, both nuclear-armed, when you get Iran that will be in the mix at some level, you have a very, very incendiary combination. So we as a nation, I think, need to have a conversation about what to do about that situation. And I think ultimately, we're going to have to call the powers of the world together and convene some sort of conference that designates Afghanistan as some sort of independent, neutral territory where we can actually collaborate as world powers in maintaining peace, much like you saw happen at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, 1815, 1820, where southern Netherlands, a trade route for many of the powers then in Europe, was carved into a no-fly zone, so to speak. Belgium, it held for 100 years, managed by the powers of the region. There's no reason why a similar model couldn't be put on the table and talked about. I fear that any alternative will lead to civil war, conflict. The longer we're there, we're dragged into it. It presents a very, very dangerous set of circumstances for our people, our nation, and our troops, and it's crying out for resolution.
So, after being in Afghanistan for 10 years and the protracted effort in Iraq, what has been the implication for the war on terror? Is all that effort for naught, or have there been marked strides in the ability to reduce the amount of terror in the world? And is this the model that we should be using for dealing with terrorism?
I don't think we should be using the Afghanistan model again. We went there because it was an act of war. We couldn't get the Taliban government to turn over Osama bin Laden to justice. We brought him to justice. We stayed because we couldn't quite figure out how to get out, and we couldn't stabilize Hamid Karzai and leave because of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda mixed in there. We've dealt a very, very serious blow to Al-Qaeda. We've taken out their number one guy, their number three guy, the number two guys on the run. The organization has transformed. It's not capable of executing the kinds of major strikes that we saw 10 years ago with 9/11. It is capable of inspiring individual acts of terror. So an individual might bring a machine gun somewhere and shoot people or blow himself up. And if we let up on it, maybe it could reconstitute itself. But we've done a lot through working with allies over the intervening 10 years. We've had governments like the Saudi government strengthen their approach to terrorism. We've had arrangements with governments like Yemen. We've got help from countries in Africa like Uganda and Kenya, which are supporting efforts against terrorist organizations in Somalia. So there are lots more alternatives right now, and we've got to find more cost-effective ways of dealing with them. But I've always been concerned, I have to tell you, about the war on terrorism, because what I saw it used as a way of raising the consciousness of fear in the American public and using that fear to take away our sense of confidence and purpose and security in the world. It broke my heart to see Humvees with machine guns parked outside the Pentagon with a U.S. Army soldier, 19 years old, manning that machine gun. And I'm wondering, what's he doing with it out there? But it's like a different country. We aren't that kind of country. So I think we've got to, it's a very difficult thing for someone in political life to say we've won. Because as soon as you say it and something happens, you've been totally discredited. But the fact is that we've really dealt a heavy blow to Al-Qaeda. We can keep the pressure on. but we shouldn't keep using the fear as a way of shaking America's sense of purpose in the world or confidence in ourselves and our institutions. It's time to move beyond that. We are the most powerful country in the world. We got through this period. Let's move forward.
I hope we learn a lesson or two or three about the nature of conflict in tribal countries. We sometimes wander in without thinking through carefully what the exit strategy, what the longer-term implications will be. If you break Humpty Dumpty, how do you put it back together again? And I look at Iraq, and I say, we forgot to remember what happened after the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1920, when the British took over southern Mesopotamia, and they tried to change society under Sunni leadership in ways that failed by 1932, which impacted the elections in the UK. Rise of strongman leadership following that period. We move in. One of the lessons, again, Wes, is, reliable intelligence. We've got to have reliable intelligence on which to base these critically important decisions on. But when we go in and we forget that dismissing Sunni leadership, army, civil service, police, and leaving a vacuum, which is then taken by Shia leadership, we've given Iran all the run room they need in the region. Moreover, we've given 150 million Shiites throughout the world reason to think that they too can create a similar transformation in the countries in which they reside. So I think at some point, when we kind of reflect on what we have done, the institution building, the civil society building, which I think is all good, emancipating certain populations, helping with respect to women's rights, there's a lot that has been worked on that is good. But I think we need to remember going forward that getting involved in conflicts where you've got age-old animosities, hatreds, vengeances, is a very difficult place to be in terms of getting in, trying to transform that lay of the land, and then leaving unscathed. And that's where we find ourselves today. And I would hope that in Afghanistan, that we would recognize the gains that we have made. We had to move into Afghanistan given what happened on 9/11. That was in our national interest to respond. We can debate Iraq all we want. That's a different category in my mind. But I think we as a people, we as a nation, would be amiss if we didn't learn the lessons of our recent history and apply it to your generation.
So, Brad, can I come back on that just for a second on what Jon has said?
You asked me earlier about Kosovo, what the lessons were, and I didn't quite give you a direct answer on that.
Look, the reason Kosovo worked in 1999, and we couldn't call it a war because nations in NATO wouldn't permit it politically to be called a war, so it's called an air campaign. But we actually laid out the political framework for what we wanted to happen before we ever decided to use force. We actually had a plan for negotiations we presented to both sides of the conflict. One side refused to sign it. If that side had signed it, we would have had an occupation of the ground, we would have had a resolution for disputes, we would have had everything set. So before we dropped the first bomb in 1999, we already knew what the political outcome was going to be. It was just a matter of using the escalation of force, what we call escalation dominance, and convincing Serb leader Milosevic that he couldn't win and that the longer he stayed with it, the more he was going to lose. Until he eventually tossed in the towel, pulled out the Serb troops, the war stopped, and we implemented the plan, the UN approved it, and there's been peace there and a new country's there. It's not a very big country, but if you're an Albanian American, I don't know if there are any in this audience, but they're very, very proud of it, and we saved 1.5 million people, and we did it because we went at it the way you're supposed to do diplomacy and the use of force. supposed to figure out what the end state is first. Line up your legal authorities. Bring your allies on board. Assign the tasks. And only when all that's done do you resort to force. We violated those rules completely in the case of both Afghanistan and Iraq. Afghanistan, as John said, and I agree with him, we didn't have any choice. We went in there. But we hadn't thought through what was going to happen. The Taliban government collapsed. We didn't expect it was going to collapse like that. But that was a holding action. That was so the administration could go into Iraq. They started making the plans to go into Iraq on the first day after 9/11. I went through the Pentagon. I talked to the generals. They called me in. These are guys that used to work for me. They said, "Sir, you can't believe it. We're going to go to war with Iraq." I said, "Why?" They said, "We don't know." I said, "Was there new intelligence? Did he have something to do with 9/11? They said, "No." I went to Senator Graham, who was the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I said, "Senator, I don't understand. You're read into everything. I'm not. Is there something new?" He said, "No, there's nothing new." And then I went back into the Pentagon in November of 2001, and one of the three-star generals called me into his office. He said, "Sir, you're not going to believe this. It's just a memo here. It says, we're going to go into 7 countries in 5 years. It's going to be Iraq, then Syria, then Libya, Lebanon, Somalia, Sudan, and eventually we're going to take down Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Don't show it to me." And so I've never actually seen the document. It was just a concept paper. But they weren't thinking about the politics of it. I'm in the office with the planner and the Joint Staff, and I said, "Okay, this is 2002. We know we're going into Iraq. We know we're planning. It's what we've done in the United States Army since the end of the Gulf War in '91. We did nothing but war game what to do against Saddam Hussein, how to get to Baghdad and so forth. Yeah, but where's the political piece of it of what happens when you get there?" So I was asking one of the 3-stars, I said, "Where's your phase 4 in the plan?" He pointed up at the ceiling to the office of the Secretary of Defense. He said, "They won't let me do it." So you go back and read the books carefully, you'll find that when Colin Powell and the State Department tried to get the Pentagon to plan for what would happen, the Pentagon, under Secretary Rumsfeld, basically sort of fended him off. They went through the motions. They knew, because Rumsfeld is an incredibly smart guy who's a real inside player. And he knew that if you ever unpacked the end state and listened to the things that Jon Huntsman just told you about Iraq and the post-Cold War era, that nobody would support going into Iraq, just like President George H. Bush and Brent Scowcroft didn't support it in '91. They knew it was a bag of worms. It was going to be an impossible problem. And so I guess what I'm saying is, you want us to talk about personal experience. That's the personal experience piece. Please, when you get in a position to influence this, do not believe that when you drop the first bomb or you send the soldiers in, they can solve the problem. It's too hard for diplomats. Let's send in the military. God, if I've heard that once, I've heard it a dozen times in government from people who don't know what they're talking about. After the Vietnam War, everybody jumped back and said, "Okay, we can't do that again." But then 20 years later, they forgot. We went into Grenada in '83. We went into Panama in '89. We kicked Saddam Hussein's legions out of Kuwait in '91. We stopped the war in Bosnia in '95. We stopped Milosevic in '99 in Kosovo. And it looked like, hey, call on the military, can do. Yes, but the lesson is you've got to think before you act. And you've got to use all the power of diplomacy and economic strength and have a vision for where you want to come out before you decide to commit the first soldier or the first aircraft to combat. And if you don't, woe be unto you. You'll be picking up the pieces for a long time. And that's unfortunately what I think both of us are saying up here about Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, thank you very much. I think that I'm going to change gears for just a moment, but I'm going to build on this last point about the role of diplomacy, the importance of using diplomacy, and especially understanding the cultural circumstances and other factors that are on the ground. And I want to use that as the transition point to talk about China. Henry Kissinger's new book on China, which is also entitled On China, he makes the point very loud and clear. I find that very confusing. But he makes the point loud and clear that he believes that one of the largest barriers, if not the largest barrier, that obstructs a more cooperative relationship between China and the United States is the fact that both sides fundamentally misunderstand each other culturally, they misunderstand each other's values, and they misunderstand each other's preferences, their interests. And according to Kissinger, if it's the case that we can overcome that barrier, then we'll be a lot farther along in terms of diplomacy. So to begin this question, I would like to begin with you, Governor. The question is really in two parts. What are the major sticking points in U.S. China relationships, in the U.S. China relations going forward? But the second question is, how do you feel about Kissinger's point, which is that there's some misunderstanding there because of our lack of understanding culturally. And the reason why I want you to sort of tee up this conversation is because there are these anecdotes about your role as ambassador in China and how you used to do things like ride your bicycle around the streets of Beijing and how you reached out to the citizens in Beijing and China as a way to put a human face, like I said at the outset, on U.S. China relations. And so if you can draw on your own personal experience to talk about this, I would appreciate that.
Well, I got a really good buy on a bicycle there for about
that's what it was.
$57, an old green variety, built in 1949. It served my needs very, very well. But, to put it in perspective, so I'll take you back because we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the opening to China, whether you realize that or not. And Kissinger was over at this conference. We both spoke a couple of days ago in India. And 90 years old. And I reflected on when I first met him. I was 11. My father worked in the Nixon White House for a year as a staff assistant. And the only time I got to see him was when I'd go to visit on the weekends. And on one weekend, I was roaming the halls. You can't do that anymore in the White House. It used to be a pretty open place. I ran into a guy named Colonel Alexander Haig, your predecessor, Wes. And right next to him was Henry Kissinger's office, National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. I was 11 years old at the time. I didn't know these people. I didn't much care. I was looking for the Coke machine, the vending machine. And I was introduced to Dr. Kissinger, who was in his office doing stuff, just as some young kid running around. And he said, will you help carry my bag out to the car? And of course, sure. And carried a black bag and walked with him out to West Executive Drive, right next to the White House. And he was getting in the car, and I said, where are you going? And he said, don't tell anyone. It's a state secret. He said, I'm going to China. And that conversation has been rolling around in my head since I was 11 years old, when Henry Kissinger went off. And I told this story to President Obama when he appointed me. And I'm a Republican. I was appointed by a Democrat for the simple reason I believe in putting your country first. It's a pretty simple principle. And I would hope the rest of you, when you have an opportunity to stand up and serve, that you'll put politics aside and do what's right for your country. But I shared this with President Obama at the time, and he laughed and he said, he'll probably be carrying your bag someday. And there was a New York Times reporter who picked it up and wrote it. And days later, I had lunch with Kissinger, preparing to go out to China. And he met me in the lobby, and he said, I understand that I'm supposed to be carrying your bag. And I thought, if this isn't a change in history. But so he went on in July of 71 to Pakistan, then a very, very close ally, a relationship at the time that worked, and he disappeared. He went up to the summer home of the Aga Khan, then head of state. He got the flu, took a motorcade out the back door and ventured to Islamabad International Airport and jumped on a PIA plane, Pakistan International Airway, showed up in Beijing, July of 1971, and prepared the way for Nixon to visit the following February 1972. Nixon, lands in Beijing. Now get this. If you can imagine something like this happening today, I mean, we forget, how dramatic this deal was. we were fighting the Chinese in Vietnam. They were manning a lot of the anti-aircraft installations there. They were in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, 1972. We had fought them a generation ahead of time on the Korean Peninsula. Chinese lost 400,000 men, including the son of Mao Zedong, who's still buried there. So all of this going on, and a president lands in Beijing, and shakes the hand of Zhou Enlai, a handshake that transformed the world. No trade, no cultural connections, nothing. Just a balance of power relationship because they feared the Soviet Union. We needed their help as a counterweight against the Soviet Union, and it was a convenient balance of power play, the old kind of realpolitik school of foreign affairs. And I fast forward that time in history to where we sit today. Largest trading relationship in the history of the world, soon to be $400 billion a day. 120,000 Chinese students in America, some in this audience. And the two countries on the world stage today. What's happened over 40 years? Nobody would have guessed 40 years ago that this is where we would be today. So China finds itself on the world stage, and here's the trick. We've been on the world stage as a country for a long time, and we've taken the slings and arrows and the criticism. We have pretty thick skin as Americans, because everybody wants to criticize the Americans. We're always to blame for different things. And as I get around and speak to groups of Chinese students in China, where I get out to practically all the provinces, and they'd want to gripe about the United States. Why do you do this, with Japan, or this with Taiwan, so forth? Say, we're an easy target. We're easy to criticize, but guess what? China now is on the world stage. Recognize that. And again, China's on the world stage 20 years before they thought they would be there. So the curtains on the stage have opened up, and the band is trying to get ready to play, and they've got their backs to the audience right now. That's how I would describe China. They don't quite know how to take the responsibility inherent with being on the world stage and use it in a leadership capacity, because they've never had to do that before. They want to glide behind the United States. That's a convenient position, because they don't have to assume necessarily the responsibility with that. And now those days are gone. China's on the world stage. We now have to forge a relationship with China that is beyond the bilateral. For 40 years, we've forged a relationship based on shared interests, trade, investment, some cultural stuff, a little regional security, to now the world's most important relationship. How do you do that? How do you all of a sudden forge a relationship now that is a global bilateral relationship as opposed to just a traditional bilateral? You infuse North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, Burma, South China Sea, global environmental issues, health, economic rebalancing. It's all part of the U.S. China relationship today. So the trick for us going forward, the United States, will be, how do you forge a relationship that speaks to trust? Because that's what Dr. Kissinger was getting to. We're divided by the Pacific Ocean. 5,000-year civilization, longest on Earth. We have the longest surviving constitution on Earth. Different languages, different political systems, different worldview, different view of the role of the individual in society. We view the Jeffersonian prism. They view through a Confucian prism. How do you get at the table? The Chinese being probably the best long-term strategic thinkers in the world, and we're probably among the very best short-term tactical thinkers in the world as Americans. And there's a divide at the table. How do you bridge that gap? And how do you talk about the issues that need to be talked about while instilling and building trust in one another? That's a hard thing to do. So I would submit to you that the challenge going forward for us, we'll trade and people go back and forth and we'll do okay, particularly when we're out of an election year, because during an election year, everyone likes to talk about China as the fear factor as opposed to the opportunity factor. Because I found out standing on a debate stage for the presidency, you don't get people giving you applause lines when you want to talk about the reality of the relationship and try to throw out real solutions to the problems. You get applause lines when you say, we're going to war with China, or I'm going to slap tariffs on China on day one. That's a reality. So you got to get the election year behind us, because what's happening in China? They have a leadership change, the most significant, I think, in the history of the People's Republic since '49. 70% of the top 200 leaders are turning over, including 7 of the 9 members of the board of directors, the standing committee of the Politburo. The stakes couldn't be higher in China right now. enormously complex behind the velvet curtain. It's all playing out. We saw some of the drama recently with Bo Xilai in Chongqing. And out of it, we're going to have new leadership or re-elected leadership. They're going to have the 5th generation of leadership, starting in early 2013. So you go Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. Young, confident, well-read. You can engage him in conversation. I found him to be a good interlocutor. You can kind of deal with him, I think. And he'll rise and lead China for the next 10 years. And he's part of the 5th generation, which is important to note because there's a big difference between the 5th generation and the 4th or the 3rd, and I know members of those generations as well. They're not forged, their worldview, by the Great Leap Forward, 1960 to 1964, the upheaval of that period. Their mind is not necessarily seared by the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, although many lived through it. Their most prominent point of reference is 30 years of 8, 9, 10% GDP growth. The world's never seen anything like this in terms of economic performance. So therein lies the challenge for the United States, connecting our new generation with theirs in a forum, in a format that speaks to a global relationship trying to deal with the thorniest issues in the world today. We can't escape it. We've got to make it work because there's too much at stake.
So is there truth to the story that you rode your bicycle to a meeting of your counterpart in the Chinese government?
Well, it is true. It is true. A couple of times. My residence was not far from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, so on a good day, I'd saddle up on this old Chinese bike, and I'd show up at the gates of the Foreign Ministry, and of course, they'd say, "There's a crazy American ambassador. What do we do about this?" They look around. What do we? Where's this black armored Cadillac? The flag's flying, and they'd open the gate, and I'd pedal up, and they didn't know what to do with a bike. You say nothing about the U.S. ambassador. What do you do with the bike? But it always gave me great comfort to take that bike and to park it right in front of the North Korean ambassador's car, parked right there. It's just a visible juxtaposition of our two styles.
Well, General Clark, I'd like to build on this topic for a moment and just extend the question a little bit. So China is building up its military, and especially its navy, which gives it the ability to project power, which is a little bit unprecedented in Chinese history. And they're doing it mostly for the purpose of securing sea lanes so that they can acquire oil. But from a military standpoint, do you think this has implications for the U.S. role in Asia, in that region, and for the traditional ties that the United States has to allies there like Japan and South Korea? Is there a potential for flashpoints of sort of security breakdowns in some of those areas on the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Strait, maybe the Sea of Japan, as a result of the ability to project their power?
I want to answer that question. I also want to come back to the way John laid out the relationship. So, yes, there's no doubt that China is building up its navy and its military. And it's a great power. And why shouldn't it? That's what great powers do. And its defense budget's growing rapidly. It's buying the best technology it can buy from the former Soviet Union and Russia today. It's buying it from other countries where they'll sell it. And it's getting it from us inadvertently through commercial sales and through some degree of espionage, including cyber espionage. And they believe they need this force because they have strategic interests to protect in the South China Sea, in the sea lanes, and they also see it as a reflection of their manifest destiny. And this takes me back to the relationship issue. Relationship with China is not just about establishing a personal relationship. Of course, they value this. This is the way the Chinese have traditionally done business, is they use the personal relationship. But they're representing states' interests. And they're measuring their interests against ours and their power against ours. And so how that relationship evolves depends on our power. 2005, I was in China on a business trip, and I met a young investment banker who also doubled as President Hu's youth advisor. He's been 1 year at the Kennedy School. He spoke some good English, not great English, but enough to communicate, and he explained it this way. He said, for 200 years, he said, China has been taken advantage of by its neighbors. They've come into China, they've invaded, they've carved off pieces of Chinese territory, they've held us down. He says, no more. China is today a great power, will never be taken advantage of by our neighbors again. He said, but we don't include you Americans in that. We know that you Americans were great friends with the British, and they gave you leadership of the world. China, he said, wants to be great friends with America, so you will give us leadership of the world. Now, this is a man who had weekly contact with President Hu. He was reading all the inside documents in the Communist Party, and that's the way he explained China's aims. So if you say this to an American audience, they always chuckle, just like you did, because it's so unimaginable that we would simply say to the Chinese, please. We used to, run the United Nations, please. It would be better off in Shanghai or Beijing. Goldman Sachs, you can take Goldman Sachs too. And suddenly all these institutions of world leadership will be dominated by the Chinese. They have their secret language of Mandarin and their secret writing, which not everybody masters easily, but they speak English to us on the outside. This is not a vision that sits well with most Americans, partly because it seems foreign, it seems to reverse the natural order. But the truth is that if we don't get our own act in order economically, it is the direction in which policies will be pulled by the weight of economics. Today we have the greatest universities in the world. China's built 100 R100, spending $100 million a year in research, universities in 10 years. I was at Cornell giving the commencement address a few years ago, and I asked the president of Cornell, what are you doing with the Chinese? He says, good relationships with the Chinese. I said, really? Explain it. He says, 4 universities, we work with them. We bring their young people here, they send the young people, they do research in our labs. We show them how we structure the research, and we provide them, the system, the way we monitor it, and the way we regulate the intellectual property and everything. They go back to China, they take, that system, and so I said, okay, I see what they're getting out of it. What are you getting out of it? He said, we have really good relations with China. They're drafting behind the United States. They're using the systems that are in place to build their economy. China's about China. They want to grow. They've got 800, 900 million people who want out of subsistence agriculture. They want middle-class lifestyles. They're not like Japan in the sense that they're not an export market. But when we tell them to revalue the renminbi, they will. When we tell them to make the renminbi convertible, they will. When we tell them to focus more on their internal market, they will. But we won't necessarily like that if we haven't taken care of our own work at home. Because if you look at the natural evolution of where China's going, it's going like this. The renminbi will become more valuable, and Chinese banks will become more dominant in the world. Money management will move from New York and London increasingly to Asia and increasingly to China. The Chinese have targets of what they're trying to buy around the world in raw materials. They will buy this. They will have long-term fixed-price contracts for these raw materials to be brought to China. And they will, just as they've done with rare earths, make it more difficult for the rest of the world to have the raw materials that we want for our own economic growth. And they will deal with their internal market and develop their own technology. They'll have their own system of intellectual property protection. But that system will be very valuable to them. The Chinese are expert in this. They protected the secret of silk for thousands of years. Silk was a state secret in China. Every departing traveler was inspected. He couldn't carry out the silkworm. He couldn't take the secret away. The people who worked on silk were the emperor's special industrial corps, and they were special to the state. So it's nothing new to protect intellectual property. The point is that the Chinese see the world coming their way, and they view themselves as a middle kingdom. That's their vision. What we want to do is look at our own economy. We're the richest resource-endowed country in the world. We've got 1/4 of the population of China. We can grow faster than 2% per year economically if we get our act together. We can grow if we get rid of this idea that government is the enemy. The U.S. government is what made this country. It bought the Louisiana Purchase and Alaska and built the Transcontinental Railroad and gave us a space program and built the wonderful armed forces that we're all so proud of, the interstate highway system. All of that came from government leadership. We've had this terrible debate for 30 years about what the government can do or not do. We need to get on with it. What are our critical industries? Where do we want to lead? It's not just about turning it loose to the free market. It's about having an American vision of what's of interest. John Kennedy had a vision of going to the moon. He said, we're going to do it. He didn't say, let's see what private enterprise can come up with. You guys launch some rockets and see what works. He didn't. He pulled together a nation. The question is whether we can do that in America. Because if we don't, all the warm relationships with China won't stop the gravitational pull toward an economy that's growing at 10% or 9% or 8% a year, 8% on a bad year. It's like my friend said to me when we talked about China in 2005. I said, you're growing fast, you want to be the leadership of the world, but there's one thing you don't have. And he said, what's that? I said, you don't have the rule of law. He said, yes, he said, I understand what you're asking. He said, but tell me, he said, why is it that a group of very wise men 230 years ago could lay down some decisions and statements that would better solve today's problems than the wisest people today who are focusing on those problems? That's the gap that Ambassador Huntsman's talking about in the two systems. It's a fundamental question that we as Americans have to answer. And if we can't achieve a vision for the country that pulls us together, that uses the government in its proper role without sacrificing our freedoms and liberties, but gives us a way forward, we will be falling into that vision of turning over to the Chinese something that we consider is quintessentially ours, which is our world leadership, our values, and what we believe in, and our ability to project it around the world. So there's a lot riding on this relationship with China. And it depends not only on warm personal feelings, but on what we do in America itself.
Let me just comment for a second on what might surprise a lot of people about China. Because some people say, what surprised you most about China? And I've, again, lived in Asia 4 times, starting in the late 70s, and I've seen the rise of the region and specifically the rise of China in recent years. I would have to say the thing that surprises me most, Wes, is the level of insecurity in China. Right. People say, really? Well, they're on top of the world. They're rising 8, 9, 10%. They, $3 trillion in the central bank, largest users of electricity, so on and so forth. We look at China, and we look at all the big numbers. 1.3 billion people, second largest economy in the world, rising military, largest user of electricity. They look at themselves and they see a completely different picture. They see complete disequilibrium in terms of income earning between the rural areas and the city centers. They see 99th in terms of per capita income in the world, somewhere between Armenia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. They see 700 million people still living on $2 a day for the most part. They're trying to bring them up in the world. And they see a world in which there are 600 million internet users and 90 million bloggers, and they don't know what to do about it. And I would tell you, fundamentally speaking, I would not trade our issues, our challenges, for the ones that they have on the horizon. I mean, just look at the math for a second. Look at the inverted pyramid that they're up against in terms of how they're going to cover their costs going forward under a one China policy now for a generation or two. And you wonder why labor costs are rising 10, 15%
per year in the southern manufacturing zones of Guangzhou. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 wage earner. You've got more people moving off into retirement now expecting Social Security and health care benefits than you've got people moving into the labor force. It's upside down. And the only way that they're going to be able to pay the bills, it sounds impressive to have $3 trillion in the central bank, but guess what? You start drawing down on that pretty quickly when you look at the social safety net investments that they're about to embark on. Affordable housing, retirement pension programs, health care, particularly in the rural areas, so on and so forth. And how they make this transition from the largest export machine ever created, at least in recent human history, to a consumption machine. Because let's face it, the challenge in China today is how do you convince the average citizen to take out a renminbi, $1, from under the mattress and invest it in their economy? You've got to build confidence in your direction. In order to build confidence in the system, you've got to address some of these nagging social safety net issues, because every 20 years or so, there's been a moment of upheaval or tumult. Just look at the last century, starting at the Boxer Rebellion, 1901, and just take it forward and look at the upheaval every 20 years or so. That's what's running through the average person's mind. Is it time yet to take my renminbi out and actually invest it in a long-term investment in my country, or do I continue to hoard it? So that's the challenge going forward, as one Zhao Bao told us in one negotiating session after we went on lamenting, health care and, economic challenges and the environment, so on and so forth. He said, how'd you like to have this problem? How'd you like to be moving from a world of 800 million farmers to a world in which we only need 200 million farmers? We got 600 million redundant farmers on our hands. What do you do about that? And you wonder why they're pumping $600 billion in stimulus spending every year into the economy, building roads and rail and airports and port facilities. What do you end up with? You end up with a lot of roads to nowhere. You wind up with upside-down inventory because of the reckless spending. And you wind up, as I think we'll find, like we did with Japan 20 years ago, a lot of non-performing loans at the banks. And I think that is going to be the issue to keep your eye on going forward. The non-performing loan, not to get too wonky about it, but the non-performing loan portfolios at the major 4 state banks, what they begin to look like when the real accounting is in, which we don't have any kind of reading on yet because of transparency problems.
Well, can I just follow up on that for just a second?
Yeah.
I do.
In a minute, we do need to.
I do want to underscore what you said, John, about insecurity, because whenever I deal with the Chinese, I get the same feeling from their leadership. They are insecure. They know they're sitting on top of like a tornado underneath of repressed demand and insecurities from their own people. And so they don't have the sense of legitimacy of American political leaders. But just to circle back to the question you originally asked, Brad, about the military side, I think we have to be very, very careful about what we're doing in dealing with China with military force. China's not an enemy. China's a growing state that's mostly concerned about China. There's no reason to brand China as an adversary. They want what's best for China. But as a growing state, as a culture that's traditionally got a pretty strong xenophobic streak, you could get into a conflict over the South China Sea if you let it happen. Whether it's a U.S. Navy destroyer in an exercise with the Vietnamese when something happens or something else. And we've got to be sure we've got the relationships and the strategy to keep all this in perspective. And that's why we've been fortunate to have great men like you, John, as our ambassadors in Beijing. And we've been lucky to have them. And obviously, you did a great job there as ambassador, and we're all proud of you for what you did.
Well, we really need another hour to complete this conversation. At the outset, I promised a discussion about Iran and nuclear weapons. I'm going to have to break that promise because we need to open we need to open up to questions from the audience, and I'm guessing that probably one of those questions will arise in the Q&A. And one last thing I'd like to mention, if it's possible for you to just say something. Let's ask the students to organize themselves quietly and file back to the microphones. And as they do that, if both of you could think about some advice that you have for our Vanderbilt students, And at some point, before we can conclude, if you could give them some direct advice about how to confront some of the challenges and opportunities that they have going forward. So let's field some questions. Let's begin over here on the right-hand side.
Gentlemen, I just want to say first, thank you for your service, and also thank you for coming to speak with us tonight. General, you know better than anyone here how powerful the U.S. military is, and you talked about how using soldiers in the place of diplomats and how that fails miserably. But yet recently in Afghanistan and Iraq, we're seeing the use of our military not only offensively, but also as a police force, even as an aid force, rebuilding what was broken. I'm curious as to what you feel about these newer roles for our current military. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think we've had some great work by the young men and women in the military in trying to help deal with the police problem. We've seen this in all of the nation building, and I use that term advisedly because you can't really build someone's nation. But from the time we went into Haiti, then into Bosnia, then into Afghanistan and Iraq, we've been very conscious of the problem that you cannot use the military to do police work, but you must have a police force that's not corrupt, that respects human rights and the rule of law, and that has to be trained afresh. And our real problem hasn't been the performance of the men and women in uniform. It's been the inability of the United States to field the non-military groups of people, trained and capable, who can perform the civic side of the function. So, for example, we often mobilize reserve lawyers to help these countries in their ministries of justice. We mobilize reservists who are policemen in private life and send them over there to stay with their police forces. We don't have anybody that's dispatchable who can train in civic governance. You don't have reserve civil police because people don't do that in the United States. You don't have groups of people who can run municipal power systems who are in a reserve mobilizable corps that you can send abroad. Say, here's the way you run your electric power system. So we tend to overutilize the military. And this is not in America's interest. We've done it for expediency purposes, put an excessive burden on the armed forces. It's worked to a certain degree. But one of the things we've needed all along is we've needed a trained group of people who can deal with the civil side of government when we make up our mind to go into a place, so we're not just relying on men and women in uniform who carry weapons.
Thank you.
Let's go to the left-hand side over here.
So I first want to thank both of you all for coming to talk to us. As was alluded to, the issue of a nuclear Iran is perhaps the most, or one of the most pressing foreign policy issues that we face. And during President Obama's term, we've made great strides in economic sanctions. At what point do we sit back and reflect and say that these sanctions haven't worked as much as we want, and what becomes the next step after that?
This is an excellent question. Governor, why don't you take this?
Let me start by saying that I think the mullahs in Tehran have decided to go nuclear. I don't think there's any stopping that. That's my own take. And I think they've watched the world evolve in recent years, and they've watched North Korea with maybe a half dozen crude devices, but nobody can touch them. So there's some national legitimacy in the minds of, I think, the leadership in Tehran, but they also saw Libya, which had nuclear weapons, or moving in that direction, and they gave that up in exchange for relationships with the United States and the international community. So I think we have to, at least in my own mind, I've concluded with the idea that they're moving inexorably toward that level of legitimacy that nuclear power will give them. Then you have to say, can we live with that outcome or not? If you conclude that you can live with that outcome, then I think you have to see a reordering of the Middle East as a logical follow-on to that. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, probably going nuclear as well, which to my mind makes the region untenable. I think it's impossible to then reverse the proliferation concerns. It would be very realistic. And if you can't live with that outcome, then you have to say, what are the steps that you can take to prevent that from happening? Sanctions would be one. Where do you go for sanctions? You know, the United States we can only go so far unilaterally. You've got to actually work with people who are doing a lot of trading with Iran. And that would be members of the UN Security Council, China and Russia specifically. So I worked with the Chinese on the first round of Security Council sanctions. And I will tell you, without breaking any confidences, I think the Chinese have gone about as far as they're going to go on sanctions. They've taken a lead from the Russians to some extent, just the Russians take China's lead on North Korea. And China didn't want to find themselves isolated in the international community when everybody was looking at doing sanctions. So the first round of sanctions basically includes a lot of language, which the Chinese ultimately embraced. Now the hard part is drafting the annex of the sanctions package for the UN Security Council resolution. And in the annex, you then begin citing individual names of companies, banks, trading houses, and getting very specific about who you're going to target. And that's where the Chinese, I believe, will say no. We've done one round of saying we're not going to go that far. I don't know that the Russians will do that either. I think in the minds of the Chinese and perhaps the Russians, although the Russians, I think, care a lot more about the proliferation side of things, I think they've already factored in a world with a nuclear Iran. So I think they've already crossed that threshold. I believe this country is going to face a conversation in the next year, maybe two, where we're going to have to, determine whether or not we're willing to have all options on the table, including military options. And I believe that would initially mean supporting Israel's desire to want to take out their facilities, because the fact of the matter is you probably got 6,000 to 8,000 centrifuges that are spinning in Iran. Underground locations are very hard to get to. At some point, they're going to have enough fissile material out of which to make a weapon. I think that's a reality. Let's just face the facts. What do you do about it? And I think we're then going to have to decide what we do about that. And it's not an easy call, but I think we've got to begin with the premise that we're going to have all options on the table in terms of our public pronouncements at this point, because Tehran needs to know of our resolve, frankly. And then we have to do some very serious analysis on what price we pay. I think the American people deserve to know what kind of price you pay by getting involved in conflict for which we would be blamed. What is the economic toll? What is the toll in terms of lives of our service members? And how far does it actually set back the Iranian government? Is it 1 year? Is it 2 years? You're never going to take it out completely. You're only going to dismantle it temporarily. And then where does that leave us? So we've got a lot of issues to cover as we go forward. But let's give the sanctions a little bit of time. Let's continue to work with those major trading powers that will work with us on the issue. And that begins with petroleum. And it kind of moves to the banking sector from there. And do everything within our means, overt, covert, to try to disrupt the ultimate production of a weapon of mass destruction.
General, what are your thoughts on this? Is there a
tough question.
silver bullet?
A lot of thoughts. First of all, there is a military option. As of now, there's a military option. It goes back to something that Undersecretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz told me in 1991. After the Gulf War, I was a one-star general. I went in to see him one day in the Pentagon, and I said, Mr. Secretary, you've got to be really happy with the way U.S. forces did the Gulf War. You know, we threw him out in 4 days and destroyed a lot of his forces. He says, yeah, he said, not really, he said, because we didn't get rid of Saddam Hussein. But he said, we did learn one thing, he said, we can intervene militarily in the Middle East, and the Russians won't do a thing about it. And that's been our understanding now for 20 years. Well, now the Russians have just decided they were going to intervene in Syria. First, they blocked the UN Security Council resolution with Chinese help, and now they've admitted they've got advisors on the ground special intelligence people on the ground to help Bashar Assad. And they've had a Russian ship in the Syrian ports, and they're modernizing that port, and apparently they are going to deliver more armaments, or in the process of doing so, to the Syrian government. This is a change. It's a big change. So set that aside, we got a real military option against Iran. And I'm not going to spell out everything, but imagine you massed all the weapons of the U.S. arsenal. You went in cold start. You finished it off. You could take out every torpedo boat, every submarine, every missile launching site, every air base, every anti-air defense system that they have in place. Couldn't do it overnight. It's about a 3-4 week campaign. You might lose a couple of aircraft. You wouldn't have huge losses. If the Iranians came back and said, oh, we're going to destroy Israel in the process, listen, there's nothing the Israelis would like better than to go into southern Lebanon and clean out Hezbollah once and for all. And they would. So there's a lot of concern about what the Iranians might do back. But the truth is, if we really went in with overwhelming force, 6 weeks later, the Iranian government would be on the run. The Straits of Hormuz would be open. The spike in the price of oil would be down, and there'd be no nuclear capacity left in Iran, because we'd have sent special forces teams on the ground to dig into those enclosed sites, and we'd have run it down. But then what? We've got a nation of 75 million people with no government, devastating war, regional conflict, and we don't know how it ends. And as far as I know, nobody's come up with the end state of this. So if you wanted to do a real military option, you should go to the United Nations and say to the United Nations, let's plan out the next government in Iran. Here's what it's going to look like. And if you did that, the Iranians might take you seriously. The truth is, the Iranians, this is just Wes Clark's view, I don't think they think we've got a military option. We just published, you can see it on the Drudge Report and on Huffington Post today, that they did a war game and everybody's really upset about what the Iranians might do back. The Iranians know that. They read it. They say the Americans don't have an option. Listen, we went into Panama in 1989. Noriega, the night we went in, Noriega was in with what we call a bimbo in the Panamanian Defense Force Officers Club at the end of the runway. The American paratroops are dropping on the runway. He comes running out in his undershorts after his aide knocks on the door. He said, El Jefe, the Americans, they're coming, they're dropping on the runway. He said, my God, I can't believe they're doing this. This is after 6 months of warning Noriega to knock it off in Panama or we were coming in. When we told the dictatorship in Haiti to get out, and we sent Colin Powell and Senator Sam Nunn from Georgia down there to negotiate in '94, the junta in Haiti didn't pay any attention to them. The airplanes took off from Fort Bragg, and some guy who knew Cedras lived in North Carolina, saw the airplanes, called Haiti and said, General, the airplanes are leaving, you're going to be invaded. Suddenly, he got religion, called in Senator Nunn and Colin Powell and said, we want to surrender, please give us asylum. They were gone in 2 hours after we had the 82nd on the way. When we started bombing in NATO in Kosovo, I'm sure Milosevic didn't believe it would last. The Russians had told him, don't worry about NATO bombing, they can't hit anything we did in Afghanistan, won't make any difference anyway. NATO will fall apart. NATO didn't fall apart. When we invaded Iraq, Saddam Hussein was quoted as saying he couldn't believe the Americans really were coming. He never thought we would really do it. I talked to the Libyans last year. I told Gaddafi's people if he didn't surrender, he'd be pulled from a hole in the ground. I told him that in April. In September, he was pulled from a hole in the ground. They didn't believe it. The Iranians don't believe there's a military option. And until you make them believe there is a military option, the chance for diplomacy to work is much reduced. But the problem with this is, and I'll stop here, is I don't know what the Chinese and Russians are going to do. They're getting really tired of us using force. They don't like it. It makes them look weak, and it robs them of their influence and allies in the world. And China is building a strong relationship with Iran. And so is Russia, competing with China in this. So this is really tricky. And the longer it goes on, the greater the likelihood of a change in Russian policy that will see them pour anti-aircraft defense and technology into Iran that could reduce our military effectiveness there. We've run the same play since 1991. We call it shock and awe, but it's the same play. We know how to go in and take out the air defense system and turn off the lights. We did it in Baghdad. We did it in Belgrade. We did it in Kabul. We did it in Baghdad again in 2003. We know what we're doing when it comes to this, and we could do it in Tehran. I'm not sure they believe we will do it, but we've got a window of time for a military option. After that, it's too late. So I hope diplomacy works. I don't want to see us go to war, but I hope the Iranian leadership understands President Obama is a pretty decisive guy. He said he wouldn't tolerate an Iranian nuclear weapon. He said we were going to get Osama bin Laden, and we put SEAL troops in there and we got him. And if I were the Iranian leadership, I'd listen very closely to the President of the United States, because he's a man who means what he says.
Well, unfortunately, I think that, do we have time for one more, or are we finished? We have time for one more. Okay, so let's go to the back right-hand side.
I'm Shafiq Hakimi. I come from Afghanistan. I just came here on August 2011. And I want to say that when people want to think about Afghanistan, what kind of country it is, before you see Afghanistan in the Soviet invasion, in the war, in the civil war, you have to go to the 50s and 60s and beginning of 70s. When in the middle of the ocean of fire in the region, Afghanistan was an island of stability and happiness. We were a good nation. What happened was, it happened in 1979, when a bunch of Soviet-motivated communist generals took over the government. And then what happened was, almost 40,000 of Soviet troops followed these generals, communists, to keep them in power in Kabul. So what happened was, we could live with the communists. Soviet Union collapsed in 1990. We would have gotten the victory in 1990 peacefully. But what happened was, President Ronald Reagan sent us guns. U.S. ambassador to Pakistan came in Afghanistan, in Pakistan border. He took a Chinese gun and shot toward our country. And they announced their war, not our war. We got Stinger rocket launchers, and we started war against Soviet Union. Soviets failed. They went out of the country. Do you know what Americans said? Okay, we got our objective, and let them do what they want. They have to build their country themselves. But we fought the West's war. We were a proxy people fighting the United States war. Everyone in the panel knows it better than I do. And what happened after that was, during 1990s, in 1980s, United States encouraged Arab nations to send all their anti-infidel extremists to Afghanistan. They came in thousands. And almost some years, 20,000 of them took Pakistan and started their jihad in Afghanistan. So after Soviets went out and United States left us as there in the middle of all these conflicting powers in the region, all these people came in and they built Al-Qaeda. And we saw the consequences. We had the Taliban government, and you had 9/11. We had London bombing. We had Madrid bombing. We had Berlin bombing. And today, just yesterday, an American a civilian man was killed in Yemen on cold blood. So my question is that if you do repeat the 1992 or 1990s experience, leave us alone, let the Taliban come back, let Al-Qaeda follow them from Pakistan, from their hiding cells and sanctuaries in Karachi, Quetta, and all these places, come to Afghanistan, make the platform again, and plan their next 9/11. And they were doing. But Osama bin Laden's ambition was to assassinate President Obama. It's obvious just on the news these couple of days. So if you did repeat these mistakes, what we get is Taliban government. We are ashes. We are a conflict, poor country, nothing to lose. But you will lose a lot.
So I think that the question
The question is, can United States afford the same thing? But I will say one thing more at the end, that United States in the West or in Afghanistan, they are not there to build a 21st century state there. You are fighting your war. If you are using your taxpayers' money, we are getting the byproducts. But the main products, which is beating and eliminating terrorism, you are getting that. And that's your national security. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. Let's take this question. And let's do it this way. How about you take the question about Afghanistan? If you want to say a few things to our Vanderbilt students, that would be great. And then let's conclude with comments from you, speaking directly to our Vanderbilt students, giving them some advice about how they can prepare for some of the rigors and challenges, some of the opportunities that they face. Excuse me?
The question was from Governor Huntsman.
Okay, we'll ask them both to field the question. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So, so I think that the question is.
John, go first. You laid out the vision for Afghanistan after we leave, and I didn't.
Well,
answer this question, and then I'll. If you
I was
didn't,
going to ask if he could repeat the question, please.
How about if I do it? So I think if I understand the question correctly, the question is, if we withdraw from Afghanistan, the Taliban reestablishes itself, and this is not only bad for Afghanistan, but has implications for the United States as well. So this is a lose-lose situation, and is this really what we want?
Well, it's not a lose-lose if people are emancipated in Afghanistan where they weren't before under the very oppressive leadership of the Taliban. So we've seen waves in Afghanistan, as you described, starting in 1979 with the invasion of the Soviet Union and putting the first president, Barbara Karmal, in power, who was later killed by his people. We saw those years. We saw the proxy wars that took place in Afghanistan, the Taliban years, and here we are. Both of our countries, the United States and Afghanistan, have been brought together by conflict. We need to learn from our experiences and recognize that the future of Afghanistan, I think, will be inexorably tied to stability created by economic uplift and opportunity. I think that's the only long-term answer. And that's where the United States, I think, can use some of its levers of power more effectively than it has in the past. It was very instructive to sit in Kabul when I visited several years ago. We had forward deployed National Guard troops who were there in Hamid Karzai's office having a conversation. And he said, you in the West will never understand what it's like to run a tribal government. He said, I run this oasis of democracy, apparently, you call it, called Kabul. He said, I can't even return to my home province of Kandahar. They don't recognize my legitimacy. He said, that's how difficult it is. And I asked him, just wondering about regional prospects for stability, I said, how are you doing with General Musharraf in Pakistan? He said, I haven't called him in 2 years. We don't talk anymore. And I thought, my goodness, this is a tough situation. What's left? You know, our people have suffered. And I'll never forget when I visited Kabul after my conversation with Hamid Karzai, I went to speak at a memorial service for one of our National Guard troops from my state who had been killed the day before in a firefight. And I spoke at his memorial service, eulogizing him. The hardest thing I ever had to do as governor. The harder thing to do was to pick up his personal belongings and deliver them back to his wife in Salt Lake City, Utah. And she opened the door with their 4 kids standing there. And I handed over Scott Lundell's personal belongings and thanked her for her service, family service and sacrifice. And she was stoic and strong. I'll never forget this. It was, one of the more poignant moments of service as governor. And she said, I can live with the outcome because I know he believed in what he was doing to help the Afghan people. And so you've got to remember the reservoir runs very deep in this country about the commitment that has been made on the part of American people. We don't want this relationship to end in terms of capacity building and improving the lives of those in Afghanistan, eradicating the areas of despair. And that's going to be an ongoing relationship building exercise that will be part capacity building, civil society, part institution building with government organizations that many private organizations can do, doesn't take a military, and part economic development opportunities. Let's go for the long term, and let's see what both of our countries can achieve, not today and not tomorrow, but over the long haul, because we both made an enormous investment in longer term stability and friendship.